Hi there. So I thought, given the way the class has gone, that maybe a supplemental little mini lecture might be in order, connecting some of our material. In particular, you can think of the title of this little mini lecture as Knowing God in a Digital Age. So I want you to think back to our discussion of Lynch's book on knowing in a digital age and some of the themes of our discussion there. In particular, the idea that it's a few different ideas. That it's easier to come to know quickly things that are not deeply or interestingly contested. There are various things that we know that we can know very quickly. But these are typically things where either they're not contested at all, or the nature of their contestation isn't especially interesting. They're weird conspiracy theorists, but you can rightly rely on sort of the most common answer on the internet or something like that to be factual. All right, so it's easy to know things, lots of different kinds of things in the digital age. And in fact, given the sort of way in which we ruthlessly prioritize things, or our brain does, a lot of us don't even try to keep those things in mind. We kind of replace knowledge with know-how, digital know-how, because we know that if for some strange reason we need to know what, say, the technical definition of a mammal is, we can just look that up. We don't need to memorize that. But when it comes to contested claims, the digital age puts us in this position where we see people sort of ramifying their views with echo chambers and the sort of the resource mappings that allow echo chambers to be stable. People in those echo chambers don't just exchange their own personal points of view. They also provide a sort of network or mapping to resources that will make sense and be acceptable or interesting or valued because of the distinctive commonalities of the echo chamber. And not to say that there wasn't, groupthink or some sort of inability to consider how a different kind of person might think of a matter before, but we see that ramified in various ways in the digital age. Also amongst younger folk, digital natives in particular, but not just them, we see a kind of a cynicism of whether anybody can know these things. We see something that's contested online. We have sort of an assumption, if we're really familiar with the digital age, if we grew up with it, we're sort of, especially in the States with our culture war background, there's a sort of tendency to think this is going to be biased. This is going to be reflecting some one particular view, maybe with an agenda. This is just how the world works. And the cynical and burnt out amongst us can find our own echo chambers. People who are similarly cynical, similarly burnt out, and will have a similar mapping of resources that will sort of reinforce us in our cynicism. Another thing that we talked about is the danger in the digital age that our digital way of being, can take us away from real experiences and relationships and community that's outside of the digital. The digital isn't unreal in one sense, but it is inherently artificial and more susceptible to being modified and tailored, edited than some other things. If you go on a hike with someone, they might socially present in a particular way, hoping to have a certain sort of influence on you what you'll think of them, but nature is nature, right? And them being there in real time, there's a sort of a coming right up against the way people are, that puts certain limits on how much you can control somebody else's impression and what can be shown. If someone wants to represent themselves as an excellent hiker, but they don't prove it on the trail, embody it on the trail, then it's not as likely to be how you experience it, right? And similarly, there's a sort of pressure in the digital age toward what can be sort of conveyed quickly in a quote-unquote digital moment, as opposed to sort of the long-term project, the sort of attention-sustained and thought out sort of in a sort of slow cooking of the mind sort of a way. There's a tendency, partly because of the mediums we've developed in the digital age, or partly because of the nature of the digital age itself, to think a bit more imagistically, a bit more topographically, and a little less in terms of the sort of the long, slow developed thought that written culture could foster, but didn't always foster. And it's important to note that from a digital, sorry, my kids are fighting in the background, that we've always been a tool using niche constructing species. Just like a spider expresses its nature by spinning webs and modifying its environments in order to work out its nature better. So similarly, for as long as we've had recorded history and longer, what we've been able to piece together or guess at before that, we have been tied to our tools, to fire, right, to the stone axes and implements of very early on, and before we even invented agriculture, but certainly thereafter, we have been a tool using niche constructing species. And one of the reasons that, especially for a mammal, we can be in the incredibly different ecosystems that we inhabit and flourish there is because, in a way, we are the most flexible animal when it comes to modifying our environments and making them more habitable. But you might think that the digital age is a little different. It's got at least the potential to be a bit different, because historically our tools are things that we use to change how we get to interact with the world. Again, this sort of accountability to the world outside of us, the world that is not artificial. And with the digital age, there's this possibility of an incredible part of our life sort of disappearing into the niche itself, of not just interacting with the world differently in virtue of our tools and making the world outside of us a more friendly place for our flourishing, but sort of retreating from the world into an artificial one and deriving our meaning and identity from this artificial sort of environment. Okay, thus much should have hopefully be review. But I bring these things back up to sort of relate them to the four models of religious epistemology that we've been discussing recently, and to make it some integration on board here. Because I think, you can think of them as competing models, but you can also think of them as facets of a complex sort of a picture. And I think interesting things are happening on each of these levels in the digital age, that on the one hand introduce sort of new worries or new levels of old worries for being able to come to any sort of religious knowledge in each of these sort of perspectives. And then we'll get to maybe a more positive gloss in a sec. So let's maybe just run through these four models and relate them to this hopefully familiar in the memory banks discussion of the digital age. So first is that model that what we should be relying on is publicly available evidence, evidence that anybody could admit as evidence. That's not distinctively anchored in one particular person's perspective or experience, and that operates the same, has the same evidential value for you as it does for me when we're talking about it. And so we can have a sort of fair and objective discussion, hopefully, about the import of the evidence. All right, so what happens in the digital age? You might think one of the things that happens for this perspective is we experience here, as in many other places, a glut of information. There is more information that is just relevant to figuring out what you believe on religious matters. There's more information on that in particular than you could possibly look at or evaluate. Granted, like, the more you look at it, the more you sort of get a sense as to like what kinds of things are out there, or more that things repeat or what have you. But the fact of the matter is, it is a little overwhelming, especially if you're coming at this with a mind not made up. Then the idea that you could sort of process a representative sample of all the publicly available evidence and then come to pick out one particular religious perspective and think this is correct, and I think this is where the evidence in total points, can be a bit of a hard sell. What is more psychologically salient for a lot of people, I think, is just the fact of disagreement, the fact of contestation. So we sort of experience, the internets, and we're looking for, for evidence that's not partisan, and probably the thing that's going to stick out most is the fact that evidence is claimed by different parties, and that there's a lot of it, and that it's not straightforward in the way that those claims that we easily know in a digital way are. All right, moving on to the second sort of model, and why you might think, moving, from that sort of perspective, things are complicated. From the sort of situated rationality sort of perspective, the idea that rational evaluation is relative to a set of background beliefs and prior probabilities. So from this one, the fact of echo chambers stands out as especially worrisome, right? That if anything, the worry about situated rationality, is, it seems like, to the extent that you kind of get caught into getting a weaker or stronger version of this, and the stronger one seems to potentially collapse into the sort of public reasons perspective, and the weaker one is a threat to collapse into relativism. All right, so you look at the phenomena of echo chambers, and the way in which you have a kind of communal bootstrapping that seems to happen of, I experience you who are saying exactly what I would say or what I do say, right, and are introducing me to resources that confirm what we were thinking anyway. And so from my position, from my background beliefs, it seems like they're constantly being reinforced. But that seems to be something that can happen for just about anybody. And so you might worry that the nature of our situatedness, in a digital age in particular, lacking that sort of accountability to the real world, or sort of attenuating that, kind of allows situated rationality to float a little too close to the relativism pole of that weaker or stronger tension we talked about, to be a comfortable place to sit. If you want to rely more on experience and the idea that we have distinctive experiences that undergird our rationality, in sort of as which we talked about with the Alston reading and whatnot, then again, another sort of way in which the digital age sort of complicates things is us, again, sort of taking away from real world experience into sort of an artificial environment where you might think, on the one hand, whatever sort of experiences have been undergirding and fostering religion over time, they didn't come from the digital age, right? They came from experiences in a sort of different way of life. And you might worry that we're less likely to have those to the extent that we're living through our digital technology. And this could apply both to like experiences of nature and that sort of thing. We're not immersed in nature and a sort of experiencing it personally and directly, and also in terms of our experience of religious communities and our experience of sort of silence and solitude and prayer with a quiet mind, I guess you could say. I might worry that all of these, maybe the digital age is pushing us away from experiencing those in a deep way. And another worry, of course, is that to the extent that you take yourself to have religious experiences that are digitally mediated, our sort of knowledge of the ways in which it is artificial and can be sort of edited and sort of it's sort of produced for effect and refined for effect. You might worry that even if you have an experience that feels real, that is digitally mediated, there's this heightened worry that it's going to be one that we've produced in ourselves, as it were, rather than something authentic coming from a sort of a direct engagement with reality. And then finally, there's the sort of glut of experience reports of you can't experience things the way someone else does. And there's no particular reason to think that all religious experiences need to be counted equally or whatnot, but you go to the internet and you want to compare your experience with those of others, and it's pretty easy to find experiences that reinforce yours, that you can hold on to just because they reinforce yours, which would get us back into that sort of echo chamber problem. Or you just have a lot of different experiences including some that are in tension with or seem to contradict those that you have had, and you can find lots and lots of people who have a ready line to give you explaining away your experiences. And then finally, if you're relying on a sort of externalism that's claiming a sort of causal link between something and human nature and facts about the sort of the truth makers of religious claims, one way or the other, then there's still sort of a worry in there of if we by nature are the kind of beings that can create a niche that influence, that don't just have, let's call it a first nature that specifies all our dispositions exhaustively about how we are going to react in any given situation, our sort of first order dispositions. But rather we have part of our first nature is the capacity to build a second nature, right? One that refines or adds to our dispositions in light of experience and culture and whatnot. And if we are increasingly sort of living in light of our second nature, living in light of the sort of the artificial niche that we've created, then you might think that, well, the relevant beliefs and experiences are, I worry that they're increasingly sort of causally mediated by what we artificially create, as opposed to just being determined by sort of a sensus divinitatis implanted in first nature, right? Likewise, there's a concern that second nature, either through culture or agency, can, if it increasingly is playing this big, larger and larger causal role in explaining why we do what we do, not that you could ever completely sideline first nature, then we have this question about whether you can sort of muffle or mask, as the term goes, whatever innate religious dispositions we have. And we get evidence for this possibility, of course, even in Plantinga's theory, that has to have that wrinkle because of the noetic effects of sin, right? This sort of idea that what we do with our agency, we and as a species, he already thinks that can affect our sensus divinitatis, our sort of built-in religious sensibilities. So if we have a radical innovation at that level, why wouldn't that also impact these things? And if you look at the way in which industrialization and the advance in our technologies sort of historically matches a process of secularization, then you might likewise think that's additional evidence that maybe factors about the digital age are helping to mask or impair, any sort of reliable first nature link to religious truths that you might think we have. Okay, so these are some more reasons to sort of worry about, or at least think hard about, what living in the digital age might do to religious epistemology, different models of religious belief. But you also might think that it's at least thinking about whether there might be another side of the coin. This was also part of our discussion of the digital age, of you can at one and the same time think there are real reasons, causes for concern for this digital age, while still thinking there are certain positive aspects that need to be drawn out too, partly because it might not be an option to us to undo the digital age, but to wear the digital age differently, that is an option. So one place to look is whether our experience of the digital age might help to clarify for us the value of some pre-digital forms of being. So for instance, take the history of Romanticism and the way in which the Industrial Revolution changed how people thought about nature. Historically, you see nature as a threat, as wild, the possibly beautiful, but not home. But then the Romantics, partly as a reaction to industrialization, start encountering nature in a different way, and you might think there's something insightful there, actually, that they learned anew to appreciate some of the beauty and some of the goodness and some of the ways in which we need wildness and wilderness to be fully human. So similarly here, I think a lot of people are reacting to the digital age by prizing and voluntarily interacting, with nature and with others in community, whereas before necessity might have driven us to take some non-digital ways of being for granted. I think you see in various areas, whether that be adventurous sports, or monastic retreats, or what have you. You see people seeing anew pre-digital ways of being and appreciating the ways in which we might need them. So that's one way. Another way in which it might help is the way in which solidarity and connection with people is made possible in new sort of ways that aren't geographically bounded. our online communities don't have to be echo chambers, and they don't have to militate in the direction of a lack of nuance, um, but that has to be sort of intentionally chosen and cultivated. You have to decide that you want to be confronted with other ways of being, other, um, and so you might think that the encounter with difference doesn't just have to be confusing, and it can also lead to sort of nuance and new insights and clarification. Similarly, I think, well, online spaces being used to sort of foster growth, to places to contemplate and create, to reflect, and to be sort of challenged and coached in one's sort of next steps beyond what people local to you might be capable of, is also a possibility. People who can perhaps help coach you in your sort of your life outside of the digital age, and sort of ways in which one might use the digital age as a means of helping someone pursue goods outside of the merely digital and artificial. So there's more questions and more in the line of what is suggestive on the positive picture, but that makes sense in a way, given where we are in the digital age. But I think it's worth pausing at this point in the course to integrate these things, to think about how religion, which we've had for a very long time, is interacting with the digital age, which is just in its infancy, and some of the interesting and important complications, worries, and potentially opportunities that come from this confluence. All right, thank you.